come up in the 3-year lectionary rotation by which we normally get our scripture lessons. It's not one you hear much about on Sunday mornings. Some of you with longer memories like mine, might remember hearing the story in Sunday school, but I think even recent Sunday school classes just don't talk about it. Well, we're going to dive into this story a little bit and see what word is in there for us. It might help you to have a little bit of background. Gideon was enthusiastic to follow the Lord. He believed in God, he trusted in God, he wanted to do what God wanted. Now, God had told him that he would give the army of the Midianites, who were camped just below a hill, into Gideon's hand. So Gideon got ready, he recruited an army, he recruited and maybe badgered and begged, and he came up with 32,000 people. A fairly impressive army, you might think, until you looked at the Midianite camp of 135,000. At best, they were outnumbered 4-1. Now, if you think about a camp of 135,000, granted it wasn't a city with markets and streets and all of that kind of thing, but even so, just to have 135,000 people camped would probably be a space at least as large as Blair and Taylor combined. That's the army Gideon was looking at. He knew he was outnumbered 4-1, but God had promised. So I'm sure that Gideon was thinking, God will find a way to take these 32,000 and make them have the strength of 132,000 so we can defeat the Midianite army. But that's not the way God works. You see, Gideon trusted in God. He said he believed in God, and I know he meant it. But he forgot and began to depend on his own resources, his own ability to recruit an army, to get followers, to do the work that God had put in front of him. I wonder if sometimes we don't fall into the trap of thinking like Gideon. We say we believe in God, and we mean it when we say it. But we still rely on our own efforts to get through. We still accumulate, maybe not an army, but we accumulate money. We accumulate possessions. I doubt that anybody in Gideon's army would ever have appeared on the TV show The Hoarders, but we might. We accumulate stuff because we think it gives us some sort of security. We accumulate connections. It's important to know people who know people so we can get things done, especially if we're in trouble. We too, like Gideon, say we believe in God and mean it, but our actions would give the impression that we're trusting only in ourselves and what we can rally around us. Well, let's see the lesson that God taught Gideon. He said to him, you have too many people. And Gideon went, wait a minute, I can do the math. 32,000, 135,000? I don't have too many. But God said something very important when he was explaining this to Gideon. He said, I could send your 32,000 folks in there and give you the victory, but then you know what? You'd be tempted to take credit for it yourselves. You'd be tempted to say, we got rid of the Midianite army. Just like us. When God gives us the gift of of the possessions we need, the family we need, the friends we need to get us through tough times. Sometimes we fall into that trap of saying, we did it. We did it. Look at us. We're pretty good. God wanted none of that. So he said to Gideon, you go to your 32,000 men and you say, anybody who's afraid, excuse me? They were about to go into battle. They were about to meet an army that outmatched them 4-1 and had swords and weapons of all types. Anybody who has any anxiety about this can go home. Well, 2/3 of that army that Gideon had recruited said, okay by me. And away they went, back to their tents. So Gideon's now down to 10,000. Now they're outnumbered 13-1. Surely this should be a way for God to prove that it's God who saved Gideon. But God said, no, still not enough. I want you to take all your men, all 10,000 of them, down to the river and let them get a drink of water. And then follows this sort of complicated description of drinking water, like one way of drinking water is more acceptable to God than another. That's not what it's about at all. God told Gideon to watch how they drank their water, because you see, some of them would kneel down on one knee, still being able to hold their spear or their weapon in one hand. Now, I'm not going to do this because I might not get back up. But they kneel down, holding their weapon in their hand, and scoop their hand down and get a drink of water. They were still ready for battle. They were still ready to respond to an unexpected attack. Others, not very many of them, but a few, set their weapons down on the ground, got down on all fours, and I'm sure not going to do that for you, got down on all fours, stuck their faces in the water, and drank it just like a dog. They were no more ready to respond to a surprise attack than anything. God said, those are my people. Those are the people through whose weakness I will show my strength. There were only 300 of those. God told Gideon to send the other 9,700 home. And with these 300, I will give you the victory over this army of 135,000. Well, Gideon, I think, may have been wondering about God in that moment, but he did as God said. He believed in God, he trusted in God, so he followed God's instructions. And the strategy that God gave to Gideon was in the middle of the night. It was the beginning of the second watch. What that means is the Midianite watchmen were still wide awake. They had just come on duty. They hadn't gotten drowsy yet. So God said to Gideon, take your 300 men and surround this encampment that's as big as Blair and Taylor combined. String yourselves out around the edges. And he gave to each of them a jar with a torch. I'm going to set this down for a minute so I can show you what's what here. He gave them, they had a torch, and they had this pottery vessel over it. It was opaque, it was solid, so you couldn't see the flame inside. They had that in one hand, and they had a trumpet in the other. No sword, no knife, no weapon of any kind. Well, on God's signal, Gideon smashed that jar so now they could hold the torch up and the flame could be seen. And all 300 men did the same. And Gideon blew his trumpet and all 300 men did the same. Now normally in a big army, they have a few hundred folks that are trumpeters that sound the call to battle. What the Midianites didn't know is that's all they had. Just those 300. Well, they woke up in the middle of the night and they looked around and they saw these torches all around the camp, and they heard trumpets coming from every direction and must have thought, this is a Let's us get out of here. So the Midianites went running, and God gave to Gideon the victory that he had promised. So what does that say for us? Have any of you been in situations, now let me rephrase that. I'm sure that many of you have been in situations where you're in a predicament and you try to do as much as you can to resolve it, but it only seems to get worse. Maybe the predicament is health that continues to fail no matter how many doctors you see. Maybe the predicament is financial. Maybe the predicament is difficulties with family. Could be anything. You know how our own efforts can fail us. The point that God wanted to make to Gideon and that God makes to us is, I, the Lord, am all that you need. Even when your armies of friends desert you, even when your possessions and your money fails to carry you through, the Lord is what you need. God makes that promise to each one of you, that God will be there when everything else fails, and that God will carry you